Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out on a rainy Saturday to listen to me talk about the derrieres of some extinct animals. It's been really fun to listen to this session and hear about all the great work going on at the museum and the role of the Royal BC Museum in documenting the living biodiversity of the province. This is a really important role that museums play and museum collections. Another way that museum collections contribute to our understanding of life on Earth is by preserving the ancient biodiversity. And so some of the questions we can ask are similar to living biodiversity. We can look at where and when things lived. We can also use this information to understand how animals have changed over time, like how things in their bodies have changed. And so that's quite a bit of the work that I do. And in particular, I'm really interested in the evolution of animal weapons on sort of a broad scale. Well, sort of a half of a broad scale. I like the weapons on one side of the body more than the other. Animal weapons have evolved over and over and over again in many, many different groups. I'm just showing some vertebrates here, but they also occur in invertebrates, insects, all kinds of different species. And we have a pretty good idea of why weapons evolve in living animals, the sort of underlying selective pressures. Weaponry tends to evolve for fighting members of your own species because you need to guard a resource, usually related to reproduction. So that might be a special food source that only occurs at certain times of year, or a burrow, or a nesting site, or even females themselves sometimes. But one thing that we don't really have a good handle on is why weapons have different shapes, or why they occur out of like different parts of the body or their anatomy. So weapons have this wonderful diversity of morphologies. They can be horns, weird things coming out of your nose. They can be tusks. And we don't really know why evolution results in many different weapon shapes. So I'm showing a lot of weapons on the head here, but I'm particularly interested in the very rare cases where weaponry has evolved on the other side of the animal, on the tail. And in many ways, I think this is a better solution for a position to put a weapon because your head has many crucial things required for staying alive, like your eyes and your mouth and your brain. And if you have a weapon there and you're sort of experiencing injuries, that seems like not a particularly good way to do things. Tails are a little bit less crucial to survival, so I'm kind of surprised that more animals haven't evolved weapons on the other side of their body. But there you go. So this is an example of a sort of rare convergent evolution trait. And in particular, I'm really interested in a particular type of tail weaponry called a tail club, where the back part of the tail is stiff, it's not flexible, and usually there's sort of an expanded tip of some kind, so a big knob of bone or maybe spikes at the tip of the tail. And this has only evolved in two groups of animals. The last time they shared a common ancestor was over 300 million years ago, so this has evolved quite independently. They occur in my favorite dinosaurs. I'm a dinosaur person, so the Ankylosaurs are a group of armored dinosaurs. They're the ones I've spent the last 15 years thinking about every day. And these are armored dinosaurs with bones in their skin, giving them that spiky appearance. They are usually very large body sizes, and they're herbivores, and they have a tail club. The other group are Glyptodonts, which are basically a very weird, mega armadillo. They're actually really closely related to the three-banded armadillo that's alive today, but they're the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And they don't have a flexible carapace, so they don't have those little segments and they can't roll up into a ball. But like Ankylosaurs, they're covered in armor and osteoderms, these bony plates. They're herbivores, and some of them evolved a stiff tail club. So, but they didn't even overlap in time with each other. So Glyptodonts only evolved long after Ankylosaurs have already gone extinct. So they have this very similar kind of mechanical or functional structure. So like the stiff tail with the knob at the tip, but they have evolved the structure in different ways. So the details of these things are a little bit different. So on the top, we're looking at an Ankylosaur tail club from top down. And in Ankylosaurs, the stiffness of the tail is achieved by changes to the vertebrae, the tail bones themselves. They get really long, they lock together, sometimes they actually fuse together. And that expanded tail tip is formed from a different part of the skeletal anatomy. It's formed from giant osteoderms that form the spikes you can see on the rest of the tail, but they're just really huge and they're enveloping the tip of the tail. In contrast, in Glyptodonts, which are the two photos at the bottom, The stiffness of the tail comes from the osteoderms, those armor plates, surrounding the entire tail and fusing together to make like a bony tube around the vertebrae themselves, which you can see in that picture to the left. And then in some taxa, they have sort of expanded the tip of the tail, kind of inflated it outwards. And, oh, I've got a little pointer here. This is much better than just arm waving. In some species, like this Dinosaur, they might have these weird divots, and those sometimes would support horny spikes at the tip of the tail as well, which is pretty neat. So 2 different solutions to come to a similar mechanical trait. So one of the things I was really interested in with Ankylosaurs in particular a few years ago was how exactly they got these tail clubs. So there's sort of 2 different parts to a tail club, that knob at the tip and the stiff part of the tail. And I was curious how that structure evolved over time. So using museum collections all over the world and results published by other people, I sort of mapped out the different features of a tail club onto the Ankylosaur family tree and that tree through time. And we found that Ankylosaur tail clubs evolved in a kind of 2-step process. So the tail club didn't sort of evolve gradually, it evolved piecemeal, so to speak. So Ankylosaurs, of course, start with that very flexible tail, they wind up with the full tail club, but they go through a period of time where they have kind of a baseball bat tail, where the tail is stiff, but you don't have that big knob of bone at the end, which is pretty interesting. And that got me to thinking about whether or not Glyptodonts went through the same evolutionary pattern. So we have convergence in the trait itself, but do we have convergence in the way that trait evolved, which I think is a pretty fun problem to try to solve. So last year I had published a study looking at correlates or features associated with having a bony tail weapon that might not necessarily be parts of the tail itself. And I had found that there were quite a few things that seemed to be associated with having a tail club or bony tail weapons like tail spikes in other animals. Things like eating plants, having an armored body, having a very large body size, a couple of other things like having a very stiff backbone. And so what I did was I sort of mapped these traits onto a family tree of Ankylosaurs. You don't have to worry about all the little names on this. This is just showing a family tree of Ankylosaurs and their closest relatives, and at what points in that evolutionary tree those features first show up. And so we know that, for example, herbivory comes before large body size, which comes before the tail club, for example. So let's do the same thing with the Glyptodonts side of the sort of vertebrate family tree. So on one side we're looking at dinosaurs, on this side we're looking at Glyptodonts, and the pattern isn't identical, but it's pretty similar, in fact. And we can use a statistical test called a rank correlation analysis that basically just compares whether or not the order of traits is more similar than we'd expect by chance. And it turns out that it was. So it's not identical. In fact, Glyptodonts and Ankylosaurs share this very similar evolutionary pattern. So the end result is similar and the way that they get there is similar. So in both groups, herbivory, large body size, and armor come before having a tail club. In both groups, having a stiff tail comes before having that expanded tail tip, just like we saw in Ankylosaurs earlier. And something that I think is particularly interesting is that in both groups, having a really stiff backbone came before having a stiff tail tip. And so what do I mean by that? Well, Glyptodonts, like this one at the bottom here, they do a really weird thing to their backbones where they fuse pretty much all of the vertebrae so it becomes a solid shield. So all of them from sort of the back of the hips up to the shoulder, and there's basically one hinge point. So they can't flex their backbones at all. That's a very weird thing to do to your body. Ankylosaurs, for once, do not do something as extreme as that. Usually they're like the weirdest animals and they do all the strangest things. Glyptodonts beat them in this instance. But they do fuse most of the vertebrae over their hips, and they don't fuse the ones going up towards the shoulders, but they lock together really tightly. So they still have that kind of stiffening going on. And so this is really interesting because I think this might be one of the features that constrains the appearance of tail clubs over and over again. So having a really stiff backbone is very weird and probably comes with a lot of costs that make it hard to do other things. But maybe having a stiff backbone is really important for being able to brace yourself against the rotational inertia of swinging your tail from side to side. So it's not that Ankylosaurs and Glyptodonts knew that they were going to evolve a tail club later on. They just sort of had to have this thing in place in order for that to happen at all. So evolution isn't kind of directed, but the tail plug can't show up unless the stiff backbone is already there. So this is sort of an example of an evolutionary constraint. Tail clubs are rare because you need all these weird other things in place like armor and a stiff backbone and big body size in order for that feature to appear at all. And so my next question after this, so now we've got sort of the when and the how of how tail clubs evolve, is why do they even have them in the first place? Were Ankylosaurs and Glyptodonts evolving these structures in order to fight members of their own species like we see in modern animals? Does having a tail or weapon on the other side of your body mean you're using it for a different purpose? Like maybe as a defensive weapon? And so that's kind of the next stage of where I'd like to go with this kind of research. And just to close out here, I'd like to just point out that this kind of research can only happen by lots of museums collecting the fossils that are in their local areas and then allowing access to researchers from all over the world to kind of pull these data sets together. I had to travel like all over the planet basically to get the data that I needed in order to do this kind of work. And that only happens by lots of institutions working together and preserving the record of life on our planet so that we can ask these big picture questions about how things have changed over time on a global scale. So I'm really excited to work at a museum like this and start to collect some data that maybe someone else will come along and have a really cool question to ask about. So thanks very much. And I don't have an engagement table, but I did find a chunk of Ankylosaur osteoderm that's in my pocket if anyone wants to come up and see afterwards out there. So I won't have a fancy setup, but you're welcome to come up and say hi. So thanks.